goes, do you think I should write with Paul again? And I went, yes. I turned around like...
Why are you asking me?
Yeah, and I said, of course you should. He goes, why?
That is May Pang, companion to John Lennon during his fabled Lost Weekend period of the early to mid-1970s. And this is Grind and Flow, creative minds worth your time. I'm Chuck Moore. Much has been documented and dissected about this chapter of John's life and career, and because of that, you may think you know May's story. I thought I did, but did not. May has a profoundly singular perspective on her years with Apple Records, which included her year-and-a-half romance with John. In that time, she witnessed storied collaborations with David Bowie and Phil Spector, legendary misadventures with Harry Nilsson, and of course John's private reconciliations with son Julian and his first musical soulmate, Paul McCartney. Where was Yoko Ono during all this? Well, it's complicated. In 1969, college dropout May Pang marches into Apple Records' New York office and boldly secures an entry-level job. For a while, she's an all-around office floater and even works for the infamous Alan Klein. Months pass, and she winds up reporting directly to John and Yoko. Some more time passes, and then, bada bing, Bob's your uncle, May finds herself in a romantic relationship that blossoms from seeds inexplicably planted by Yoko herself. John and May went on to briefly share a life and an apartment during a time when John was still married to Yoko. I won't even try to unpack this for you. For full debrief, I direct you to a recent documentary, The Lost Weekend, a love story, now streaming on Tubi and other outlets. The film is every bit as charming, bittersweet, and riveting as the title implies, which is due to May herself, who narrates. She is so warm, so wise, and perhaps the most relatable figure I've read about in all my years of obsessive Beatles study. May is currently on tour at fine art galleries across the U.S., selling prints of private photos with John. Many are candid and unguarded, including what might be the only post-breakup pictures of Lennon and McCartney together. On this tour and in the documentary, May is taking back her own story and gifting us with an intimate look at the Beatles universe as seen through the eyes of a mere mortal. And this wouldn't be Grind and Flow without getting into creative work habits. We talk about John's need for deadlines, the pen he wrote songs with, something I'm probably more excited to learn than I should have been. But this episode is as much about May's own journey. In a world of main characters, May Pang holds her own. See what you think. Pretend I'm 8 years old. Who are you and what is it that you do?
God, 8 years old.
Pretend I'm 8 years old.
Yeah, you're 8 years old, and all I'm going to say is, wow. If you're 8 years old, where am I at that moment? That's the thing. I remember when I was 8 years old, I was miserable, you know?
Why?
So, because at that time, I'm living at home, a father who's very Chinese, I would say, and anybody who's watched my movie, my documentary, they will have realized that my father was very much, we may live in America, but in his head, we were still in China. And that's what he was dealing with. And my mother got the brunt of it. She saved me many times from his tyranny, as I would say. But as time went on, my mother gained the strength. And that's what I look up, my mother. And moms are a great big part of my life. My mom, she just took it. You know, she said, wait a minute, I live in America now. I don't live under a Chinese rule. And she says, I can do whatever I want. You know, and that's what she did. And my father, all of a sudden, his role started to diminish, and my mother gained all of that. And I was really proud of her. She did so many different things. She learned how to make jewelry. She learned how to, she ran a laundry back in the old days. So I love that.
How did you get pulled into rock and roll?
Well, as I said before, my father was the one who really, it was that tyranny, it was that we don't speak English in this household. and could only be Chinese. But I was so rebellious growing up in Spanish Harlem, back in the day. It's also different. I didn't grow up in Chinatown. So I really had, this learning curve around me. I really had no friends because I looked different from everybody else. And so I sort of retreated within myself, and music was on TV. We at least had a TV set. And I just remember watching American Bandstand and thinking, what's this? And listening to the radio. And I was just enamored by that, all that stuff. And that's really how it got started. And I think the words, the music, it just moved me. And that's where I wanted to be. Made me happy.
So you were very young. How old were you when you walked into Apple Records and made sure they hired you? That's an oversimplification. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I was 18 turning 19.
After a year of college, May had enough of school and quit. Surprisingly, her mother didn't object, but was determined that May needed to go to work. And while searching through a job directory from an employment agency one day, May and a friend came upon a familiar business name.
And she said, what's in this directory? I said, no, what's here? She goes, Apple Records, Beatles. I couldn't believe it. I said, no, really? She goes, yeah. And I looked at the directory and I said, okay, great. And she saw me walking away and she goes, where are you going? I said, I'm going to go and ask them for a job. What else? She goes, you're crazy. I said, why not? What can they say to me? No. Right where I'm still at, no.
Right.
And that's how it started. And I didn't care. It was just the idea it was Beatles that made it a little more enticing for me.
Right.
But the idea that had to do with music, that really made it all for me. The company was brand new in the sense of where it was. So you became a gopher. You did whatever they needed you to do. But I started in music publishing, which was great because I had the greatest learning curve there because and it was Alan Klein. I know people have this weird thing, but, Alan in that office taught me a lot. I mean, I was working with such great music. I mean, you're talking about, first off, Cameo Parkway, which is a lot of people, the Frankie Avalon, the Bobby Rydells, the Chubby Checkers, the Question Mark and Mysterians, all those out of Philadelphia. That was one. Then there was another publishing company called CAGS Music, and that was all of Sam Cooke's stuff. Right. So that was another. I said, oh my God, all these songs that I was growing up on. A third one was Immediate Music, which of course is the Rolling Stones. He was managing the Stones at the time and also the publishing. And then of course the fourth one was, you had the Beatles. You had really three Beatles, George, Ringo, and John, and then Apple Records and all that publishing there. So I think I had a good training ground.
Alan Klein, famously, he's a big villain in the Beatles story.
Well, of course he is. And, and I understand it. I truly understand. But he did some good stuff that they don't like to talk about. And, when he negotiated the Beatles, contract, he did something that there was something in the contract that was always in the contract, and he went in and he took it out, which a lot of people had no idea. It was a thing every contract had where the record company wanted 10% for breakage. Alan just went, breakage. He took a record, threw it on the ground. Right. Of course, it was vinyl. Nothing was happening. He goes, that isn't happening. Right. So that percentage has to come out, that clause. And from that moment on, all the clauses after that came out for everybody.
What were some takeaways that you took from Alan Klein, and also was how you interacted him informed by your relationship with what you describe as a tyrannical father? Was there any?
Alan was he'll deal with everything later, like when we did Bangladesh, there was always just put it in that fun, that mysterious fun, and we'll deal with the, all the bills and everything later. You know, he was a smart man, but he was also a man that also liked to be, you know, he became bigger than the act. And you can't be bigger than the act. The act brought you there. Right. And that happens all the time, not just with him, but with a lot of people. You start seeing, I made this guy, I made that guy. And, you know, after a while you go, okay, fine. It almost acted like nobody had talent.
Right.
And so that becomes the problem. I just fell into the middle of all of this, which is for me, it was great because I ended up just working for John and Yoko towards the end and not for him specifically for that side of the company.
So jumping ahead to your time with John, is there any insights you gleaned from his creative process? Like watching, I've heard you say in other interviews about he was constantly writing down little notes.
You know, the one thing about John was he carried his black flare pen, and he always had one in his pocket. And wherever he could find notes, if he sees something, you know, he would just hear something that he likes, he would just write little notes to himself and just stuff it back in his pocket. And he was so thrilled that I think it was in 73, it was roughly around 72, 73, when Sony put out a cassette recorder that was also that whole idea that it can record, because prior to that was only playback. So now he says, oh my God, it's great because everything he had in his thoughts, he can now put it down on cassette and just leave it and come back to it later. You know, just frees up that little space.
Yep. Like the phone memo now.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so we all do that. So it's great. So I don't have to think about it. And it was good for him. And so when they find all these cassettes, they have different versions, and people who have listened to it, you know, on their bootleg or whatever they release, you could hear the different, when he speeds up or, you know, or slows it down. It's because that's how he hears it. He wants to test it out before he records, how he feels.
Right.
So, yeah.
Was there a particular song you watched blossom?
Oh, I saw many songs blossom. I mean, I remember when he said to me, book the studio, because he hadn't been in the studio now in over a year, for Mind Games. Oh, well, you know, it wasn't called Mind Games. He just booked me into the studio. And I had just finished working with Yoko in a recording. And I said, you're ready? He said, yep, because if I don't do it now, I don't know when I will. And, you know, that was the type of thing. I said, well, when do you want to do it? He goes, in 2 weeks. And I'm just looking at him. I said, okay, are you ready for that? He goes, well, I better get writing. He didn't have the songs ready yet. He was so in the next 2 weeks, he just wrote these songs.
He was good with the deadline, the pressure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what are you doing right this minute? Commuting? On a walk? Maybe folding laundry? Whatever it is, your time is valuable, and I appreciate you spending it with Grind and Flow. My intention is to present useful conversations with notable minds from the arts, entertainment, business, and beyond. I'm so encouraged to hear from listeners who've been sharing episodes to friends to inspire them in their journeys. I know I learned something valuable from every guest. Grind and Flow. Subscribe or follow on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. Also Instagram.
So the Lost Weekend, which, as you've discussed a lot, it wasn't very lost. That was kind of a name that he put to it later, which took it from a famous movie about alcoholism.
Right,
Lost
because
Weekend.
people were right, and that's the thing that bothers me, because people always think about, oh, he calls my time with him, because John actually said to me later, because I did see him in the last 5 years of his life, and he said, you know, they're going to talk about it like we're, you know, our time together, they're going to put it down. Just know that it's not about us. And, you know, it's always been about the fact that it was that time they'll say, oh, you were at a club and you got thrown out, or you were drunk. So, yes, in that movie, The Lost Weekend with Ray Milland, John liked to use those metaphors, you know, because he loved film.
Any films you can recall you guys watched together, or movies that he
mentioned?
mentioned?
The Way We Were. We loved that movie. we got into one movie theater, and when they realized it was John, the guy goes, "Come on in," and we said, "Okay," and we went to see this movie with Sean Connery, and I look at it and I go, "Okay," and it was called Zardos.
Oh yeah, with the famous marble bag outfit.
As we walked out of that theater, because he was such a fan of, as we walked out of the theater, he says, "I'm so glad we didn't pay for this." We both went, "This is a terrible movie." And so, we got out of there.
So did he ever consider going back to acting? I mean, he did the one film, the Richard Lester film, How I Won the War, without the Beatles, but was he ever tempted to go back?
Never talked about that, no.
So what has been your relationship to that relationship? And over the years, because that's a pretty big story.
It is. I mean,
story. And how's that changed over the years?
Well, people were taking, I would tell my story, and I was trying to be very, in the beginning, and I wrote a book called Loving John about 1983. And I tried to be middle of the road, giving both sides. But as time goes on, people like to take my stuff and stories I've told. And I always say this is like that Chinese whispers. By the time I say one thing, by the time somebody tells me, I've got something else. And I finally had to do a movie of my own. I mean, it was so different than what I hear about it now. I mean, when people come to see me at the galleries, the first thing and I'll ask them, I said, "Have you seen my movie?" And they'll go, "Oh, I don't need to see your documentary." And I said, "Really?"
They're missing out.
I know. That's just the way they react to it. Right. I said, it's a movie that I even narrate. They go, "Oh, okay." And they said, "Well, I really don't need to see it because I know everything about you." And I'll say, "Oh, really? And where is that from?" And they'll say, "I've read them all. I read everything you ever put out on the internet." And I said, "Okay, that's right." But when I really forced the issue, I said, "You've got to see the movie."
Right.
And you'll see that. And once they've seen the movie, they've actually come back and said, "I thought I knew your story. I guess I didn't."
Still dead in the earphones. All right. Whoa, still a bad sound. Treble. Oh, yeah. Let's hear it.
Friends, that may be the greatest rock and roll reunion you've never heard. John Lennon and Paul McCartney in Los Angeles, March of 1974, playing together 4 years after the Beatles officially broke up. This was just months before they signed final agreements that would put to rest some of the group's outstanding legal issues. This seismic event came during sessions for a Harry Nilsson album John was producing. One night, Paul and Linda McCartney suddenly popped by during a break. Surprise, surprise, and this happened.
McCartney's doing the harmony on the drums. Stevie might get on it there if he's got a mic. All right. That's just like more vocal, treble.
Paul is on drums, Stevie Wonder is on electric piano, and there are some hotshot studio musicians of the era in there. And today's guest, May Pang, is in there somewhere on tambourine.
When the night has come, I can't hear a thing now. I can't hear a thing. Sorry, I'm sorry, but stop. Hey! You just keep turning my earphones off. I can't hear nothing.
Allegedly, drugs and alcohol led to the less than stellar results of the session, which were never officially released. I don't know if anything here is any more ragged than much of what we saw in Peter Jackson's Beatles documentary, Get Back, and a definitive record of who might have ingested what is certainly lost to the ages. We do have tapes, however, briefly excerpted here for educational purposes only.
Hello?
Fun footnote, Ringo barely missed this once-in-a-lifetime jam. He'd been playing at that studio on those sessions earlier that evening. When he returned the next night, though, Ringo was annoyed to discover someone had been mucking about with a snare drum. In her 1983 book, Loving John, May describes the scene in which John reveals to Ringo that it was Paul who showed up and played Ringo's drums. Ringo's response to that remarkable news? He's always f***ing about with me things. Most importantly, though, John and Paul did continue to keep in touch, and a more clear-eyed public reunion almost came to be.
Two of your photos that are in your wonderful exhibit now are the only two photos I'm aware of John and Paul together during the 70s.
Right. They never took another photo together, although John and Paul saw each other. I mean, Paul was always at our home whenever he came into town.
Were you privy to any potential reunions with those guys? Because at one point, legend has it that he was considering going to New Orleans around 75, where McCartney was recording Venus and Mars. Was he intending to go there? Was he debating it?
Yes, he was. So privy, yes, because it was all involving me. We were sitting, Paul and Linda had dropped in and said, so they were saying, oh, so what's going on? He goes, yeah, we're going down to New Orleans. We're going to do our next album there, which of course was subsequently Venus and Mars. And John said, oh, that should be fun. And after they left, that evening, John, was like, ooh, New Orleans, he would love to go. So a couple of days later, I'm doing some work, and he goes, I got to ask you a question. And he's sitting on the bed. Our apartment was very small. People may think we were large. It was like 800 to 900 square feet, somewhere in that vicinity. And I said, yeah, what's up? He goes, do you think I should write with Paul again? And I went, yes. I was like I turned around like,
why are you asking me?
yeah, I said, it was like The Exorcist. What? And I said, of course you should. He goes, why? And I said, because solo artists, you guys were good. But the two of you together, when you did your writing together, no one could beat you at that. And he just sat there and he's playing the guitar and he goes, yeah, you're right. And he goes, we should make arrangements. Let's go down to New Orleans. And I said, okay.
Do you think that was hard for him to make that acknowledgement?
No, actually it was easy. He wanted to do it. He really wanted to do it because the agreements had been signed. There was no more, angst about anything else. It was all starting new.
Right.
They were all starting off same footing. So now, if they wanted to write, they can write together without saying, I didn't write the song, but I'm getting 50%. Everything was Lennon-McCartney. I actually have a certificate on my wall that John wanted to throw out, and I wouldn't let him do it. It was a certificate from BMI for the 8th year, big number 8th year in a row, where Yesterday was the big song, big number 1 song in there, and that was recorded. But it's made out to just to John. It isn't to Lennon-McCartney. It's just made out to John Lennon. And John's guy, I didn't write this. He didn't care. But he gets the money because it's in the early days of publishing, it was Lennon-McCartney. Wow. And that was part of the whole thing. So now they were all starting from scratch.
So why do you think it didn't happen?
That's when Yoko said, I think you should come back. I knew that she was up to something. I hate to say it, but I always knew that. Right. And it wasn't in the cards because she had asked for a divorce a few months earlier and he said yes. So it's all, no matter what anybody believes or whatever they want, they're not sitting in my shoes. But yes, she did ask for a divorce and he did say yes. So it was not something that, it was on loan to, people always say, oh, he was just on loan. He was just out and whatever.
And ironically, I understand Paul was the intermediary from Yoko to get them back together.
That was around that time period. Yeah. And and John never knew that Yoko had reached out to Paul for that. It was just hidden from the background. She didn't want it to be said that she initiated this. If I drew out the timeline, you would see that she had been trying very hard all along the way, trying to get John to, and he was saying opposite of whatever was happening.
Right. And coming out of that relationship, what was it, 18 months? That's a really intense 18 months. What was the timetable?
It was roughly an 18 months, yeah.
Gotcha.
We were supposed to buy a home. We were going to buy a house out in Montauk. And I got a chance to visit that place a few months back. And it was just great because he loved the water. And he spotted this house when we were on the boat and staying with Mick Jagger. And we were out fishing with Mick and Bianca at the time. And he looked up and he said, "What's that? That house?" And it looked like an imitation Scottish stone cottage house. And the guy on the boat said, "Oh, that's up for sale. Would you like to see it?" He said, "Absolutely." We came back later and we brought Julian this, it's a small home, but it was nice.
That's actually May Pang on the song Number 9 Dream from John's Walls and Bridges album, released in late 1974. The album also featured John's only solo single to reach #1 in his lifetime, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, a duet with Elton John. For specific timeline, I once again direct you to The Lost Weekend, a love story documentary. But in very broad strokes, pulling from May's account and other sources, it was around this time that John reconciled with Yoko, she became pregnant with John Lennon, and John entered his domestic house husband phase. His quote-unquote lost weekend had ended, as did his time with May. It's also important to note that John's legal immigration issues were finally resolved. The U.S. government had been trying to cancel his visa and deport him for years, a holdover policy from the Nixon era. In an interview at the time to promote Walls and Bridges, John was excited about the album and told Rolling Stone it had been an extraordinary year for me personally. That extraordinary year included reconnecting with his oldest son, Julian.
One of the parts of your story I think is so touching is your relationship with Julian and Cynthia, John's first wife. I feel you. Kudos for that. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your brokering John with Julian?
I think in that sense, I felt for Julian. I knew he needed his father. So for whatever reasons, I wanted it to happen. And because, when this kid is 11 years old, 10, 11 years old, and he's looking for his father and he's calling and he can't reach him, right. It's time to do something about that. And I was glad that I was able to be a facilitator on that. And later on, of course, Cynthia and I became very, very close. We had a close relationship, and I could see she was also floundering. She was also lost, the way everything happened. It's like I said, I may be the youngest, but I was the oldest in this group, no matter what, because I could see all the stuff that was happening. Like
any relationship, love affair is hard to get over. Talk about your journey coming out of that and coming into your own.
It was always difficult. And I remember John actually said that to me. And at the time when he said it to me, I didn't understand it. Mm-hmm. And it was only later that I finally go, oh, I said he would say he saw me once with this guy, and he said, "He's not for you." And I looked at him like, "Oh yeah, okay."
Like you have a say.
Yeah. And he said, "Everybody's going to try to measure up against me." He goes, "I'm not trying to, say it, but that's what's going to happen." And I didn't understand it at the time, but he was right. As time went on, that's the measurement, and they would always talk about it. Or guys are too nervous to approach me because of who I was with, and never thought about it until it started to happen. But I did get married at one point, and I'm divorced, but I have 2 kids, and that to me is the best part. Is I have a son and a daughter.
There's a quote that you had in other interviews talking about you consistently ask John, "Are you okay?" or "How do you feel about this?" It's like you were very concerning about him, how this was impacting
Yes,
him.
I was always concerned about him more than I was concerned about myself. Every time he would call, when people say, "Oh, he was so happy," I've now come to, to just be as honest as I can. I always say, if he's that happy, why is he calling me?
Right. And this was,
I'm not calling him.
This was in the years after you guys split and before he
Right.
died.
Yeah.
So have you had enough people in your life to be able to ask, are things okay with you over the years? You think so?
Well, thank God I have good friends around me, and they do take care of me. They do check in with me, and they do see if I'm all right. I've got friends in the neighborhood. They're always, they're good friends. I could count about my friends. They're true. It's not the fly-by-nights, and I'm very grateful for having those friends and the friendships.
All of John's fame and Beatleness aside, what do you think you learned from that relationship? Just you and John. Like, I think relationships can teach us in our journey.
You know what? It was very interesting because even though we were 10 years apart, he was just learning because he had been sheltered, from doing things. When you're out there, he had no clue on half the things. He loved New York. So what did I do? I said, okay, let's go on a bus ride. To me, it was like, okay, you want to see where I come from, what I do every day to come to work here? Let's get on the bus. And he would say, really? So I was teaching him all these little things that, he never liked being in a limo. It's not his thing. So that only was reserved for special events.
Okay.
So we were going to the opening of the Sgt. Pepper play.
Mm-hmm.
And the car came, and we were picking a couple of other people. And I remember I said, okay. So as we were getting into the car, he looks at me and goes, where are you going? I was getting in the front seat with the driver. I said, I'm going in the front seat with the driver. We're going to be picking up other people. I don't want to be stuck. And he looked and he thought about it and he goes, oh, you're right. Hang on. All of a sudden, the driver now has the two of us sitting in front with him. And he's like, oh, God. And so when we got to the theater, they opened up the back and we got out of the front.
I'm going to do a lightning round and throw some names at you.
Okay.
And certainly your impressions or a takeaway from them, but also I would love to hear if you think you made an influence on them. So I'm going to throw some names at you. Harry Nilsson.
Oh my God. He was difficult, but I loved him. Great voice, great singer, but he was really, he did it his way, the way he wanted to go.
Were you able to infuse some of your Maypangness into him?
I tried. Oh, I argued with him.
David Bowie.
Bowie, talented guy, but nobody realized he was really in awe of John. And he was nervous around him constantly.
Were you there when he and John and Paul were hanging out and debating doing a super group?
I've heard the stories. I've read this. I couldn't believe it. The only one time that it happened was John and myself and Paul and Linda. Paul came over to us and they said, what's going on? He goes, oh, David wants us to come over to his place. And the four of us went over to the hotel. And we're there. And he puts on his new record, which was Young Americans. And he leaves us and he goes into his bedroom where Ava Cherry was with, so the two of them are hanging in the bedroom, shut the door, and the four of us are standing there like idiots, listening to Young Americans a million times.
Any Maypangness you were able to infuse with Bowie to help him be more comfortable?
I said to John, when he came out the first time, Paul said, oh, it's a great album. And we had already heard it. John and I already heard it. And he said, it's a great album. what else is that you're listening to? That's all he said. And Bowie didn't pay attention. And he went in. And when the second time came out, John said it, picked up where Paul left off and said, oh, what do you have? What do you have? And he said, do you have anything else? And Bowie just sort of reacted. And after he went away, I said, I think you just hurt his feelings. He goes, what are you talking about? He goes, it's exactly what Paul said. I said, I know, but I think he's more listening to you. And so Paul came over and he says, what's going on? And he says, oh, May thinks I hurt his feelings. I just sort of said, I'm just telling you what I saw, not that it is. So he goes, oh, no, that's just the way he is. I said, okay. Came home and the phone was ringing and it was Bowie. And he felt hurt. And so that's really what happened at the end. And I looked at John and went, he goes, never mind. Okay. And he just walked away.
Phil Spector.
Oh my God. Nightmare. I used to yell at him. I used to have my fights with him. And he used to say certain things about how his description of his kids. And I said, you can't do that. That's terrible. He used to lock his kids up with a hook and eye latch and outside the door.
It's horrible. And
I said, why are you doing this? He goes, well, you have to keep kids in that way. I said, no, you don't. And I used to yell at him. You can't do that.
How was your music business adventure post-John? Did you enjoy your time?
Oh, I stayed in business for a little bit, and I did love it. But you know what? I just had to go do other things because I got blacklisted for a little bit too.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and people didn't understand it. It was just that. And I said, okay, I'll find a way. No matter what, I always believe that I will be able to take care of something. I can take care of myself. I'll find something else to do. I've actually done, I said, okay, I don't know what I could do. Mm-hmm. You know what? I want to try acting. And I wanted to see what it was like. It was a challenge to me. And I said, it looks like fun. It ain't fun. That's all I'm going to say. Doing extra work was not fun. But I ended up getting my SAG card. I ended up in a movie. Yeah. I'm actually in Heartburn.
Was that the one with Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson?
Yeah. So now you're going to have to go look at that and Absolutely. You can find me. I'm giving credit. And that's where I got my SAG card. And I was at a restaurant many years later. And I ran into Mike Nichols, of course, who was the director of this, and loved his work. And I said something. I was at this restaurant. We were both leaving. And I said, I just got to tell you, I love your work. And he said, thank you. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, by the way, I'm in one of your movies. He goes, which one? And I said, Heartburn. He goes, good movie to be in. And he walks out of the restaurant. And I see him going out of the restaurant. And I look up and I see him making a U-turn right back in. And he comes up and he comes right up to me and he says, you were in the party scene. And I just looked at him and I said, yes. He goes, I never forget a face.
Nice.
Yeah.
A legendary director.
Absolutely. So it's like, oh my God, yes.
So get ready for some useful parting thoughts from May Pang here in a moment. But first, thank you for being here. If it's your first time, welcome. Please join us again. And if you're returning, always glad to have you. Keep spreading the word about Grind and Flow. Personal recommendations are still the best way to keep this and any other podcast going. It's good to know that even in this dire age of soulless AI and algorithmic whatnot, our voice and opinion can still make a difference. You can also follow us on Instagram and now Facebook. Now here's May to take us home.
As we wrap up here, what is some advice from all your years of working with such strong personalities? How do you negotiate? How do you manage emotions, expectations, any things that you might tell your kids that, how do you deal with an Alan Klein or a John Lennon?
You stay true to yourself, and that's really where it comes down to. And if it doesn't feel right, leave. You don't need that. We're at a time where women should have some better say than the men, because I grew up in a spotlight where it was man. Everything is it was man conscious, and now I'm so glad that women have come up, and they should be. Right. And I was like the only woman doing music publishing in the, what I was doing. And I remember having a meeting with someone that was set up, and I went in for the meeting, and the guy, it was awful. And he was like, he sat there, he had his feet up on the desk. It was the typical, you look at it and you go, and I just said, I don't want the job. Even though it would have been great, I didn't want the job. I didn't need to be kowtowing to somebody like this. And I walked out.
So is this a natural superpower, or is this something you've had to come into your own and to learn from experience?
I think my mother gave me it was always the power was in there. And it was just kept bringing it back out to me, but it's also common sense. It's also your feelings of what's going on. And I mean, you got to do the right thing at the right moment. It's not like, oh, it's a free for all and let me just do it. But you got to think, is this the right moment? Should I do this now? Should I walk out of this meeting, or should I just use my head and think about where I'm going to go with this? I mean, I've had the men, they go, oh, anybody can be bought. And I remember saying to one guy, I cannot be bought.
Nice. It sounds like your mom imparted just a really strong sense of self.
Yes.